Hi, everybody. Welcome to another session. Happy Friday. Happy lockdown day. Hope you guys are doing well. Today, we're going to talk about Revit basic family creation. In the past, I did a lot of this family creation, but it is good to get people updated into some of the newer tips and tricks I'm going to be putting onto this presentation. So, today we're going to discuss about basic family creation. Sometimes you download stuff from on internet. You would encounter a lot of this, but you want to kind of know how to interact with it. But this session is going to talk about that a little bit. Now, what is family? Well, there's three types of family. There's system, in place, and component family. All of them behaves differently. System family is basically any families that's inside your project, like floor, roof, wall. Those are called system family. In-place family is basically when you create a customized family within your project. Component families is basically it's like a loadable family that you can load it into the project. Now, there are different types of families. There's model, annotation, details, and grid levels. Most often, users are familiarized with the model, annotations, and details. Typically, you also have grids and levels that display a little bit differently. They're a hybrid between 2D and 3D. Now, there are other categories as well. So other terms, there are categories, family types, instance property, and type property. Most of you guys probably familiar with a lot of this stuff. I will not get too deep into it, but if you want to know, you can always pause this video and look at all the all the all the wording of it. Now, I know most people are familiar with AutoCAD. They're basically AutoCAD dynamic block, and then there's also Revit families. In terms of AutoCAD, most often people would typically work in 2D, whereas Revit is more of a two-dimensional and three-dimensional, so you have to think about that. Here just basically a list of differences between the two. I won't get too deep, but one thing I tell you, the difference in AutoCAD and Revit is that Revit allows you to nest object, whereas in AutoCAD, you cannot nest a block and then add a parameter to drive the other stuff. So whenever you create a block, a dynamic block inside AutoCAD, you're stuck with it. Whereas Revit, you can actually put a host, like basically you can have a family, host within a family, host within a family, and then you can actually add parameter in between those families. When you create any Revit families, I always recommend people to use reference plane. For instance, reference planes, if you want to do like sizing and stuff like that, what I do typically recommend user to use is you use the reference plane. However, you can use reference line when you do rotation. For instance, if you want to do an angle, if you want certain objects to behave certain ways, you can use the reference line. I rarely use it as much. I usually just use the reference plane. Now, the question is that how do you plan your family? One question I always ask is that, do you need parameter? Parameter will add file size. It's always going to be create a very bloated file size. So what I typically recommend user to do is you want to keep it as minimum as possible. So what I did here is that I just basically create like a chart that, if you only need to create a family that's one size, I would recommend not to use parameter. Now, if you have objects with variations of sizes, you can add parameter, okay? Now, there's certain criteria where, you have to create multiple different types, but it's too complicated. You can always do something that is less complicated by making it one size for different types of family. That also works as well. I also asked the other question is that will this object display in single view or multiple view? So if you only want to see it in a single view, example plan, I typically ask, is it going to be is it going to display in plan section elevations, details, drafting views or legend? I'd recommend using detail component. But if it's only displaying in plan section elevation, detailed drafting view, or sheets, I recommend using annotation family. But if you want the objects to display in multiple view, let's say you want to create an object that shows up everywhere, I always recommend modeling it versus using a single view. The other thing I always ask is that does the family need to be 2D or 3D? So here you have the diagram just showing you what you need, okay? You start with model family, that's a show up plan only, level with multiple elevation. You can always use the 2D model lines. If it's only like level single elevation, use 2D. So this chart, like this tree chart that I'm showcasing you, it's kind of like asking you a question how you want to create your family. It's a very simple stuff. Again, it just depends on your methodology. I always like to ask that question first before I dive into family creation. If the object is going to be used for multiple cases, then I would typically recommend going with the most simplest approach, like simplest route. Don't overcomplicate yourself, because if you overcomplicate yourself, it's going to be very, very difficult to fix or troubleshoot your families in the future. Now, there are also special family types, property, okay? So this particular objects, if you notice that highlighted in red, what ended up happening is that this object only shows up in certain family categories. So if you choose door, curtain walls, genetic, model, mass, structural column, architectural column, structural trusses, and window, well, one thing I forgot to add in is site. Site is also part of this. You will get to show this particular option. The rest of the option, it will not show up. If you choose, let's say, furniture, this will not show up. All right. Now, sometimes what happens is that when you have so many complicated families and you want to add it into Revit, AutoCAD objects sometimes it's been used. You can actually import them in. I know that some people say this is acceptable. Sometimes once your project gets so complicated, I would not recommend you use this method. But in certain cases, you have to. For instance, if you're doing a lot of rendering, you need like a special car, then AutoCAD is the only way you can import in objects, car objects, and then just put it into that. Because Revit is terrible when it does the car. Okay, you can always get the blocky cars, but if you want to go like more realistic car, you have to go the AutoCAD route. So one thing you have to know is that AutoCAD, if you import them in, you can actually size them. So you can actually say, I want this size to be 2x or half size, so 0.5. And it does not respect the family, like a Revit family, which has this 1/32, right? Sometimes what happens that when you import in or insert into like a detail component and all the let's say a mullion trim, sometimes you're gonna have objects that's less than 1/32 of an inch or 0.8 millimeters. You can go as small as size as possible, whereas in Revit you cannot do that. So most often people just import in like a detail component because a lot of the manufacturers already have all this details already created. Sometimes complex geometry, sometimes I have to warn people. When you insert in AutoCAD objects like 3D solids, sometimes Revit will make that object disappear inside when you import it into Revit. So just be aware because there is some complexity that Revit cannot display. So just be aware. It's not the problem with your file. It is just sometimes Revit it's not able to process those objects. You can go with the mesh. Mesh is probably the simplest. Like you can convert, like if you're inside AutoCAD, you can convert 3D solids into mesh, and then when you insert into Revit, it will display it properly. Family visible control. So what happened is that I usually use this quite a bit. Like sometimes I use on and off parameters, okay, just to show that object to appear or disappear. The other method you can use is that you can actually change the display. Where do you want to display based on plan, RCP, front, back, or when it is cut. Also, I usually use the detail levels as well if you need to, coarse, medium, and fine. So what that happens is that for your coarse level, you can say show it like really, really generic block. But once you hit medium or fine, you can show a little bit more detail. So sometimes this helps if you have like large drawings. You want to show, for example, you want to show refrigerator. You do not want to show the handlebars or anything. All you want is just a simple box. But once you get into the medium or fine detail where you have to do elevations of that refrigerator, then you will switch it to fine detail. One thing I always recommend user, if you want to do this, this will save you tons of times, is that I usually create subcategories for different objects. For example, in this particular case, I have a stop sign. So what I typically like to do with this is that this will help you out if you want to turn off certain objects, but don't turn off all the objects. For example, right now, this is on site. You can add subcategory called poles in this particular object. And then when you load it into your project, you notice that there is a pole, okay? This will save you tons of times. If you don't do that, what end up happening is that when you're doing filtering and stuff like that, you have to know the name. And then when you export this object to, let's say, different software, sometimes what happens is that subcategory, you can add like a layer to it so that you can tell this particular object to be that layer, or else, if not, it would just use the default layer. Sometimes that could be a pain. So it's advisable to add subcategories, but don't go overboard. But if you know that, for example, furniture, you have to add like different categories? Not necessarily. It really depends on what you want to do. If you want to do like really high quality rendering, it's recommended. But if you're doing like a low level rendering, this is not necessary. All right, let's move on to demonstration. Excuse me. Don't worry, I don't have coronavirus. I know everybody's really panicking. Hopefully you guys stay safe and just keep washing your hand. Now, when you start Revit, especially in 2019, you will get this really, I don't know, some people like it. Some people may find this to be very problematic. What it does is that it gives you the screen. So if you want to go back, you have to click on this back button just to access the file that you want. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use just a simple family. So the first thing you do is that when you first start out family, pick new. Really depends on what you guys want to use. Most cases, this you can use whatever default you want out of this. This will give you tons of stuff in here. So what I typically like to do is that if I want to start something, I go with like the generic model. This generic model, what it does is that it allows you to it's a good template to start with. And the next thing you can do is that if you want to change to a different category, all you have to do is that just click on this little button right here, click on that. And now what you can do is that you can just change it to whatever category you want. So here I could say, okay, if I want a furniture, let's do a furniture, okay? Now the first thing I would do here is I would just do a simple, let's say, a table that you want to create. So the first thing I would do is I'll just draw like a skeleton. Okay. Now I want this thing to be my center. Okay. You can start out with not having this to be center. That's fine. But if you want to be a true center, this every time when you flip stuff, it will flip the correct way. Now for this case, what I typically like to do is that once you start putting in your reference plane, I always give this a full number. Okay, just start out with that. It's a good practice to do it. The reason why I'd rather do this than, let's say, for example, I know that some people recommend doing this and do equal. You guys have to be careful with that. The reason why is that if this becomes equal, your positioning of that particular 0, 0 could be shifted slightly. So you just have to be aware of that. So most of the time, I just just type it in the number, just make it full. Then I would just say equal and do the same thing here and say equal. And I would just go in here and just create that. And now the next thing you want to do is that you want to add parameters. See right here, you can click on this and say this is my width. You can type in instance parameter or type parameter, doesn't matter. There's a differences. Type parameter is basically when you create a family type, it will have type parameters. So you go edit type and fill in whatever you need. Instance parameter is just that it could be any size. You can just put in any value you want. It will just stretch it multiple times. So when do you use type and instance parameter? I would use type parameter if you only have one sizes for, let's say, different furniture. But if you know that you're going to be doing a lot of design work where you do not know the size, what size is going to be, then you keep it into the instance parameter. For now, I'm just going to use the type. Okay. Now, what you can do here is that this is a shortcut. If you want to change it immediately to instance parameter, you can always click on that or check it off. Okay. This works quite well. Okay. Because sometimes what happens is that if you use a planting family, I'm just going to demonstrate something here. Okay. If you go into the planting family, okay. By default, when you click on this, there's a planting family. When you edit this, you see that this thing gets grayed out. You can't do anything. So one trick that I usually do with this is, let's assume that here, this is a height, right? You notice that here, there's an instance parameter. There's a shortcut. So in here, it would change it to instance parameter. So that's the trick that I always tell the user to do. So if you have a planting family, and you cannot override that, that's the cheapest way to kind of go and change it to instance parameter. All right, back to here. I'm just going to go back and just call this length. Okay. Now what you have is that you have a frame. So here, if you want to flex it, you notice that, okay, it automatically works. Okay, that's your skeleton crew just trying to get it to work. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a leg. Okay. Here, I'm just going to draw in the same thing. Sure, let's go 100 millimeters. So let's say 100, 100, 100. So again, the same thing here. And this one right here. So here, I'm just going to say leg offset. And I'm going to also add in the leg. So I always like to create like skeleton first before I model it. The reason why is that it gives me kind of like understanding what kind of legs that what kind of model I'm creating. So here, what I did is I'm creating a leg, basically a table that's hosted on here. So what I did is that leg offset allows me to offset it in and out. But later on, you kind of see what I'm kind of getting at. But for now, just put it in like this type of parameter pretty easily. I'm just going to say leg. I'm just going to call it X. Okay. First thing I would do is I'm just going to go to front. Oops. Just going to cancel out of that. I'm just going to add 3 parameter here. So first, yep, that's good enough. 2. The first thing is the height. So let's assume that this is going to be 2 meters. Oh, let's say 8 meters. And the thickness of the table. So let's say assume that that's 100. Okay. So here I'm just going to go height. And here I'm going to go thickness. Now, what do I do? First, whenever you do like you kind of have to keep track what is major and what's minor. What I did here is that whenever I created like a height, I always put height as the primary, and then the next one, if you want to copy it, you can copy it down. And I just add a parameter as a height. So whenever this thing changes, let's say height, you notice that the thickness will not change. Well, will change, right? But if you basically add in a parameter where the height is going to be 1750, you notice that the thickness will always remain 100. Okay. So once you have this thing done, the next thing you do is that you just add in a model. So here I'm just going to model it versus my table. The next thing I'll do is I'll add in this little piece right here. Okay. Now I know that in some practices people tend to fill in this particular hole. What I typically recommend user to do is that I always keep all of this independent from each other so that they don't kind of clash in with each other. You could do it at one shot, but the only problem is that once this table kind of hit 0, let's assume that this thing is touching that, then the whole family breaks. So just keep in mind what you're doing. Whenever you could still do it, you could like assume that this leg, that leg, that leg, and that leg, you could just draw it all the same pieces. But for me, I've seen so many times where family becomes unusable because whoever created it took the shortcut, so they decided to do it as one continuous piece. Whenever this thing hits almost close to each other, it no longer basically gives you an error, and then the family just say, nope, it quits. I cannot do it. So just keep in mind. So the next thing I would do is that I'll just stretch it out. I'll just lock it. Okay, just stretch it out and lock it. Now, what I typically like to do in this particular case is that I like to hide things. Okay, hide element. The reason why is that I always like to stretch it and hit a reference plane. If you don't hide it, what ends up happening is that sometimes people lock it to the table itself, the object itself. What ends up happening in some cases is that your family starts to have this constraint issues. It just doesn't know what to constrain. So you just be aware of that. So what I typically like to do is that I like to hide stuff. Okay, every time I lock to a reference plane, I like to lock it. Okay, something like that. All right. So what you have is that it's just a simple table. Now what I can do is that let's try flexing it. Let's see here, it's 1.5 meter. Okay, let's say 200. Well, actually, let's go 800, for example. There we go. Now let's go 2 meter, 1 meter. Okay, looks good. Now, if you want like certain parameter to override some other stuff, so for example here, leg X it's going to be my minor one. So what I typically like to do here is that I like to organize it. So here you can just put in whatever you want. I could say, okay, let's put that as model properties. Okay, leg X, leg offset, it's probably a minor stuff which I'm not touching. Whenever you do this, it's a good idea to kind of help people decide what is the most important parameters and what is the least amount of parameter that you want the user to touch. So what I like to do is that height, length, width is something I like people to kind of interact with. While the other one, I just like to use it less and less. So I like to put those separation together. Now, if you do not want people to monkey around with this, you can always add in a value. Okay. What this does is that whenever you add in this value property, it basically locks down to that, so that whenever you load into a family, this particular one will not show up. Okay, I'm just going to demonstrate. So let's assume this is 100, this is 100. Okay, and let's assume that I'm going to load into a project. So here I'm just going to start the project. Let's go none for now, and let's go metric. Okay, so here, once you like what you're doing, save the family. But right now, I'm not going to save it. Okay. So here, when I go edit type, you notice that here it's all locked in. So there's nothing much you can do. Here I could change the size, whatever you want. So let's say that it's 2 meter. This is 3 meter and 3M and 4M. There we go. It flexes properly. Go back. Okay. The next thing you want to do is that you want to add in some material. So here, what you would like to do is that I could say leg material. Table material. You can add in a subcategory. What you do is that you go VV. And here what you do is that you just basically add in a very simple simple family, simple categories. You want to put into the family. I could probably put in legs and put in table. Okay. And hit OK. And here what I can do is that I can subcategorize this as legs or table. Now, one thing I always tell users to do is that right now you're going to have like a bunch of stuff that's going to be really hard to do, because what happens is that when you copy from like multiple projects, you're going to have a lot of subcategories. So what I typically recommend user doing is just put your like prefix on top. Let's say, for example, this one, I want to just say fern legs and fern table. So what this does is that it will categorize all those objects. Sometimes people put in their company name. That's fine. You can still do that. But for this one, it's kind of like you know what object belongs to yours. And then if you ever create different families and you copy it in, it will not mess up with your stuff. So let's say I'm going to load it in. Say OK. So now what you have is that you can say, OK, go to my furniture family. You notice that there's fern legs and fern table. Now, sometimes you will get into this hidden lines and hidden lines. Okay, why is that? If you have objects, let's say AutoCAD and stuff like that, yeah, for some odd reason, this is always going to be pain. Because what happens is that sometimes when you change to different categories inside Revit, right, originally this was generic model and I changed to furniture, what it does is that it basically added in an extra subcategories into it. So it's kind of like one of those really weird things that it added in. If I change this back to generic model, what will happen? Let's take a look. You only got hidden lines. I change this back to furniture. Aha, you see that it comes back. So yeah, just be aware of that. I think this is a bug. It used to be like when you change it, it should be fine. If you want to delete it, you can always go in there and hit delete. Some of them will not let you delete. Here, this one allows you to delete. Okay, just get rid of that stuff and say okay. Right? So just be aware. Sometimes when you flip back and forth, I think this is a bug. I don't think that it's supposed to show up twice. But in this case, things will happen. Just make sure you just delete it. All right. Now, there's a couple things in here. There's also shared, cut with void when loaded, work plane base. What are those? Okay. So what workplace base does is that, let's say if I'm going to turn this on and I'm going to turn this off. Okay. Let me get rid of this first, or I'm just going to call it a different name. So here, furniture. This is one trick that you can always use, is that you can always go in here and just rename it, and it's called a table. Just call it table. Okay. In this particular case, this is still family one, so it's going to be different. And what happened with this work plane base is that you can actually place it on a work plane, and then you can actually make it so that they kind of orient it to a different angle. So here I'm just going to load it in here. You notice that here it will place it on any surface. So here I could just say, okay, I want to put it upside down. You can do that. If you want, you can also do this. Let's assume that, let's go into the plan itself. I'm just going to create a work plane. Okay. Let's assume that you have a work plane. I'm going to place it here. I'm going to call this angle. And here, I'm just going to set angle and make it show up. Okay, so let's say that's the one. You can go in here and you can see place it. There we go. And if you want to rotate this, okay, let's assume that this is not the angle you want. You want to rotate it slightly. And there we go. So what it does is that it allows you to rotate your objects. I find this very useful, especially, I know that some people say, oh, how do you rotate it in different angles? This is how I would approach it. Okay, all you have to do inside your family, in this particular one, is that just turn on the work plane base. I know some people say, oh yeah, why don't you just use the face base, right, as a starting point? Yeah, you can do that. Okay, you can always use a generic model. Let's see, there's a generic model, face base, okay? But this is basically almost identical, okay? Of work plane base. It works pretty well. So this is why I said I don't use a lot of this face base. I just say just use this, and it'll solve 90% of your problem. Cut with void when loaded. Most of the time, I rarely use this. In some cases, you would use this if you want to cut objects. Let's say, for example, if you build a family. Yep, there we go. This one, it's basically if you have like a plumbing fixtures and you want to load it into your, let's say, a casework like this, right? You can do that. Now, the most interesting part about the family itself, here, let me change this to something else now. So let's go back to, let's get back to here. I'm just going to change my name again. Okay, let's say this is table 2. Okay, I'm not going to rename anything. So here, I'm just going to go change it back to generic model. Now, one thing you guys would use or not use, depending on your scenario, is that when you add it into, let's say, okay, sure, this is a family one, and if you want to copy this, let's say I'm going to copy it here, probably make it closer to here. There you go. Generic model, one thing I like about it is that you can actually do a joint geometry. Okay, so here I'm just gonna go. Sorry, I'm just basically moving my my go to meeting. Okay, the one thing you could do is you can use this guy, join geometry. You can join it with that. And you notice that you can actually do that. Okay, this is what I like about generic models, that you can actually join with anything. But the only thing will not work is that if you have adaptive component, this will not work. This is only work if you have just a regular family. So if you are a designer that wants to kind of like get different looks and stuff like that, I would typically recommend you just using generic model, and then you can just like massage your shape here and there, and then just do joint geometry. So this is something for a lot of users. If you want to try it out, yes, definitely go this route. Let's do a family like that. Let's see if it's able to do it. Let's see, I'm going to copy the same route. No, it doesn't do it. It only works if it's a generic model. Funny enough is that if you want to do with generic model with, let's assume that this is your generic model, and you want to create, let's say, floor. Okay, let's assume that that is a floor. Okay, let's assume that this one, I want to make it about 1 meter, 2 meter high. Oh, that's too much. 1 meter. Okay, let's assume that this is what you want. You can always go to meeting. You have to fix your menus. You can do joint geometry. Okay, there you go. So generic works well with system families. So if you have a floor, you can do joint geometry pretty easily. So that's what I like about generic model, because it's a very funky little concept that you can actually do a join. Okay, there we go. So you see there's an intersection between the various objects. Okay? And sometimes this could be a public art. I don't know. I mean, this gives you an endless possibility. All right, what should I talk about next? Yes. Okay. Inside of family, okay. Inside of family, you can actually have a different materials. Let's say right now you have table and legs. Let's assume that you have a table. You want this top part to be a different material, this side materials to be a different material. So how would I do that? So the first thing I would do typically is that I would just say go new, give me a material, and just say this is a table side material. Okay. And what you could do here is that you could go into this little bit of paint. Okay. And in here, you notice that there is a table side parameter. Okay. You click on this, you can say that this is table side, table side, table side, and oops, table side. And the top one, I'm just going to say that's the tabletop material. So in here, what you can do is that let's go load it in here. Okay. So here, I'm just going to go realistic. Okay. Here, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to add in the legs. Okay. You guys know how to do materials. It's pretty easy. All you have to do is just take the default, just duplicate it, and call it something else. Let's say this is table leg. Okay. I'm just going to go in here, just make it, let's go wood. Sure, let's go birch. Okay. That's table leg. And here, I'm just going to duplicate this and say tabletop. And here, I'm just going to use stone. Let's go. Yeah, sure. Let's use the marble. Okay. And then here, I'm going to duplicate again. Let's say table side. And this one, I'm just going to use a different material. So just to illustrate that, yeah, this is how you do like different material for different surfaces. I know in the past what people tend to do is that they like to make tabletop and the side to be two different objects. You could still do that, but I would just recommend people just use this method because it's much easier. You can just paint stuff on top of that. Sure, let's go green polish. Okay. Say okay. And okay. There we go. So yeah, you can actually have different types of materials. And this is sort of like the quick bits of how you change material for each sides. Okay. Any questions so far? All right. Now, how do you fix, one of the questions I always get asked is that how do you fix broken family that you downloaded from, let's say, Revit City? Okay. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up a sample, just a simple stuff. First, I have to find the stuff I've downloaded from. All right. This one's Spanish door. I think it's the arch door. No, I think it's one of these guys. Let's see. Let me see when is the last modified version. With bracket, like door. Let's go with the arch doorway. That looks good. Okay. Now this looks pretty fine and dandy. Okay. Everything looks fine. Let's load it in. Okay. Right now I'm just gonna draw a wall and put a door in there. Okay. Let's see how good this is. All right. One thing you're noticing is that sometimes you see that objects does not cut through. You see that right now I'm selecting it. It's highlighting those objects. So you will run into this problem in real world, right? Sometimes you want to modify it, but like, how do you do it? So the first thing I would typically do is that let's go inside this model and see what's wrong with it. The first thing you do in this kind of a scenario is to double check what do they have. In here, they do a lot of, bunch of trims and all that stuff. So the first thing I would do is isolate this object. So here, I'm just going to isolate this object. Isolate this object. Just isolate it. Okay. And notice that there is a cut, opening cut. Okay. I would just go edit that. Okay. And here, what I typically like to do with this is, since the object is basically created without reference plane, this is basically the old school Revit from like 10 years ago. What I like to do here is that just use a reference plane. Just, I guess right now, what you can do now is just pick and then just lock it. Okay. There's not that much you can do with like some of the older generation family creation. Okay. Once I load it in into the family, override it. Notice that, yep, it's truly going to cut into that. So you will run into this problem. Now, the second question is that, okay, why is this object displaying as green and blue? So one of the things you want to do is when you go to the object, by default, you see that in the door. If you open up a new template, it's going to give you a bunch of like weird colors. So what I typically like to do here is just change this to black. Okay, there we go. And let's take a look what is happening in this particular one. You're noticing that this particular object has some missing trims and etc. So what it does is that the frame inside, they don't show much, but on the outside they do. So how do you fix this? So you go back into here. Again, I would typically go to the floor plan and see what is going on. Okay. they're not going to display. You notice that they're not going to display this particular frame itself. So what I typically like to do with this is that you can do two ways. One way I like to do from this perspective is that I would usually add a reference plane to a wall. It doesn't matter what wall. The next thing you want to do is that you want to have a dimension locked to this particular wall edge and say lock it. Now, the reason why I do this is because this basically, if you want to snap onto any of the surfaces, this will become kind of like your reference plane. If you do it to a wall, sometimes what ends up happening is that it will break your family. So what I typically like to do is I just add a reference plane, have 0, and just lock it. Okay, let's call this exterior. Exterior, and then you also do the same thing for the interior if you want to do it. So let's here, I'm just going to do the interior here and just lock it, call it interior. The next thing you want to do is here is that once you have that exterior interior, you can always go, okay, how deep you want this to be. So I usually say, okay, let's go 1 inch. Okay, that looks good. You can lock it or you can give it a parameter, doesn't matter. Same thing here, 1 inch. We'll go from this particular one to that one and just say lock it. Now, once you have that, you can get rid of one of the frames. So just get rid of that and say here and here, just isolated. Now it disappears. Okay, so that doesn't help. So what I like to do is if you see this kind of a property where things get joined up together, what I like to do is that I like to do the unjoined geometry. Or the other way you can do is, let's see, I'll do it the other way, the other method. Remove constraint, there you go. That's what I would do. Here, what I will do here is that since this is created previously, what I would like to do here is get rid of all this. Oops. Oh, okay, that's very interesting. Okay, with, okay, so it has the, okay, so I'm not going to touch that because that's old school stuff. So here, what I can do is I would lock it to there, and I would lock it to this parameter right here. Oops, make sure you pick the right one. Okay. So a lot of time, what I like to do is I would not touch whatever is done before. Just look at it and see if there's an empty spot, and then you just fill it in. This is what I did is that I just basically took the previous one and just delete one side and then do the other side. So when I load it into the project, override it, notice that it fills that in. So that's kind of how you do it. And you notice the glass itself, it looks pretty weird, right here. So what I like to do with this glass is add a parameter in there so that it could display glass where it starts. So in here, particular, you notice that the glass is actually a huge block. Okay, I don't want that. So what I like to do with this, okay, you can do it in elevation or section, doesn't matter. Let's say left and right. Okay. Or you can do it in the middle of the door. I think this one, I'll just say, yeah, let's do that. Okay, let me close out of that. Let's go to back to the plan. So in here, I like to do the door again. So in this particular wall, I'll go from here, here. Again, I would not lock it, or else it'll just shift the whole thing. So just avoid doing that. So what I like to do here is that just make it 1, make the other side 1, Then now you can just lock it, okay? And set up parameters to say, okay, safeness. And here you can always go back and say, okay, this one I just want to be 1. Glass thickness. Go to one of the section. Okay, materials glass. What you're going to do is that you're going to lock it to there. Lock it to there. Okay, right now it looks pretty dandy. And then you do the same thing. And sometimes you have to do this because what's happening is that you kind of have to go in there and modify some of the old stuff that doesn't look good or realistic. This is how I kind of like ease people into how to modify whole families from, let's say, you download from Revit cities or other places. Don't be afraid to go in and modify it. Sometimes it's done based on the knowledge that they had in the past, but right now I'm just showing you like how you do it, so that in the future, if you do run into this problem, you're able to fix this issue head on. Okay, so there we go. Your glass looks like glass. Okay, if you want to make it bigger. Now, the other issue is that material. Sometimes what happens is that they already specify the material. What I like to do here is I would love to add in parameter for every single thing. So let's say, for example, the material glass. The reason why I do not like to do this is because it's not ideal, because once you lock the material in, the only way you can change it is through material. By adding parameter, what it does is that it allows you to kind of swap in those material for another thing. So here I'm just going to say glass material. And also make sure you put in the right subcategories. I like to do that because it's a good practice. This one, again, it's going to be panel, or you can say frame material. Okay, put it in the proper, you can say panel, or this could be a frame. Let's say that's a frame. This one, again, the same thing. Just say this is a frame material. That's under. This one, again, I'm just going to say this one is door panel material. And subcategory here, I'm just going to call it panel. Okay, so here, I'm going to go back in. Okay, here I can do is that you see wood. You can go back here. Let's go tabletop. Let's see table side. I'm just basically changing it to the materials that we create. Let's call it wood. Oh, let's see table leg. Right. Now, I always get questioned, why is it turning gray? Okay, the reason why it's turning gray is because whenever you have Revit, by default, when you copy from one of the default, right, it's always going to be a gray. So what you typically want to do is that once you get this material, click on this little guy here. Okay. Let's see, okay. Table side. Again, just go here. You notice that it will appear to take on the material from the material itself. So that way you don't have to monkey around what materials you're gonna be using. This will do it for you. Okay, it'll go realistic. Okay, not too shabby. Now, if you want a glass, okay, let's go glass material. Glass door. Here, what you have is that you can just go in here. You can go glazing. Let's say, sure, not insulated, because clear frosted. And there we go. All right. So that's basically a couple of techniques that you guys can use. Okay. The first thing I just showed you guys is how you do very basic stuff when it comes to creating a table. The easiest way I would suggest doing is that you could choose generic model for basically anything if you want to cut into this particular object. Also, always add in a reference plane, because reference plane will save you a lot of time when it comes to like a skeleton crew. A skeleton to kind of flex how you want it to flex, and then have the model basically attached to the reference plane. The next thing you do is that if you have models from, let's say, existing, you can always go in there and modify stuff so that you don't have to have that particular issues. So in here, I just show you guys how to kind of go in there and modify the existing family downloaded from internet, okay? And how do you modify it, and how do you load it into your family? So hopefully that's been a good thing. Now you notice that in this particular case, what I'd like to mention is that you have a bunch of materials. Let's assume that I'm going to change something on top. Let's see here. I'm just going to call it class material top. When you load it in, you notice that there's always going to be two options. Okay. If you want to override something, let's assume that you have a parameters or whatever updated. If you don't want to change it, what it does is that this will revert back to whatever's default. But if you do want to change it, let's assume that I want to do this. Okay. If I go override, you notice that it reverts back to the original. Okay. So that's how you do it in terms of modifying stuff. So here you see that I'm just adding in the glass material top. So that's a quick way if you want to like quickly change the parameter inside the family and then just load it in. And what you do is that if the name is the same, you'll override whatever is in there. So the first time when you're doing it, let's assume that here I don't do anything. Let's assume that I'm going to change this to let's say glass thickness 2. Right? Sometimes when you load it in, it will ask you yes, you want to override it, it will override it. But sometimes you will not get that message. You know, like when you load it in, sometimes it will not do anything. The best thing I would do is that if you want to override a lot of the stuff, let's say the parameter changes and stuff like that, you will load it in. If you get that message, yes, you can override it, but sometimes you will not get that message. How I typically like to do this is that you can change a bunch of parameters. Let's say for this particular one, change material is a perfect example. Here, if I load it in again, you see that it will not give me the message. So let's say I'm going to go in and change something. I always recommend user just change the material. Okay, let's say it's phasing. And just load it in. Then you will get this message called override. Okay? Yeah, sometimes people say, oh, I loaded a family, that this message will show up. Easiest way, just change the material. So you get this override, and it will just override whatever is in there. All right. Hopefully that is a handful. Hopefully you learned something. And happy Friday. Stay safe. And I'm going to be doing a lot more since we're under lockdown. So I'm going to do this periodically so that user can learn something new. All right. Enjoy Friday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.